thanks for being here. I'll be honest, I've avoided even flying this summer because I hear the horror stories of flights being canceled for 3 days, not able to get back. You have to find a different route. And it always comes down to the fact that there's not pilots in almost every situation I talk to people about. So why would, I understand Republicans always talk about not overreach in the private sector, right? You can't tell private companies what to do, but then they always talk about the free market too. And I mean, this is hurting the free market with these unvaxxed, quote unquote, unvaxxed pilots not being allowed back to work in some cases.
Well, thanks for having me on. That's absolutely right. Most of these Republicans are going to couch their argument for why they voted this way in the idea that the federal government shouldn't be interfering in the private market. And that's, I think, wrong for several reasons. And I think that this is an ongoing conversation and a corrective that we need to have within the conservative movement as a whole. So first of all, we need to remind these representatives that it was the CDC, the federal government, that was essentially putting in place the conditions that allowed for this to happen in the first place. So this is a mistake by the federal government that needs to be fixed by the federal government. I also just don't buy that there's not a role in protecting the labor market from extremist conditions for employment, like the requirement to inject yourself with a substance that has not been thoroughly tested over the long term that could have adverse health impacts on people. That's a reasonable expectation of a protection that the government should provide against the private sector in terms of employment conditions. And then the last major point here is that, the founders kind of envisioned that there would be factions in our society and that those factions would kind of counterbalance one another. And so in this, they envisioned thousands of local economies expressing their own regional interests against one another. That's not the system that we have right now. We have major multinational corporations that hold all the leverage, all of the levers of power. They're colluding with mass media and colluding with government agencies, and they're pushing political agendas. I think that now more than ever, we need to kind of take a step back from this idea that the end all be all and the goal of our entire system is an absolutist free market. A free market's a good idea, but that's not actually the end game. The end game is a culture of liberty that can sustain itself over multiple generations and withstand the onslaughts of various factions of tyranny that might try to gain control over our system. That can be the private sector. It can be government. It can be foreign governments. But conservatives need to get comfortable with the idea that we may need to use governmental power to protect our culture from things like vaccine mandates of untested substances being injected into people, and know that that's an actual conservative usage of power. And I think most conservatives and most House Freedom Caucus members, who are the most limited government types of representatives, they saw this, and most of them, I think, voted correctly on this. But overall, we need to have an ongoing conversation about we can't tie our arms behind our backs when it comes to issues of protecting our culture against agents of tyranny, like we saw during COVID.
I like what you said, the phrase culture of liberty. It appears to me that Republican lawmakers are not evolving with the evolution of the corporations having been captured by this ESG ideology. In fact, they adhere to that over profitability. And we always hear Republicans talk about GDP and profits and how that trickles down. But we're in a very different climate with the push towards this leftist ideology and the embracing of it by corporations. And yet I feel that the Republicans, and so many of them, not all, are still captured by corporations. How do we change that?
Well, they've just got to wake up. I mean, look at DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is a violation of Title VII for the private sector to predicate employment or preference employment or hiring or bonuses or benefits on the basis of race and sex. They can't do it. It's illegal. But even if that law weren't in place, conservatives would be right to act to put it in place. That's a correct use of government power to protect our society against agents of tyranny. If you have multinational corporations that are basically taking a step back and saying, if you're a white man in our society, we're not going to hire you just because you were born that way, that we can't stand back and say, well, it's the free market. The free market can just do whatever it is, no matter how corrosive it is on our culture. No. Conservatives should step in. They should use their power at the appropriate level of government. If they're a federal representative, they should use federal power and put in place something like what we have, which is Title VII, to protect Americans against that type of systemic racism and sexism. So we have a law in that case, but a lot of Republicans would look at, if we didn't have that law, and say, well, we can't do anything. It's not our role. That's just nonsense. They've got to wake up. They've got to start protecting our culture of liberty against the various agents of tyranny. And again, that could be the private sector. It could be multinational corporations, colluding with media, colluding with big government, and which, by the way, is what's going on right now. And we need them to fight against that. That can be done at the state level. It can be done at the local level. It can be done at the federal level.
Yeah, I like what you said. It can be done at the state level. I'd love to see more Republican governors emboldened to take on these corporations, because that actually makes a huge difference when we see them get in the fight. It's kind of hard to describe it as the free market anymore, since it's so chained to DEI, ESG, and this leftist ideology. But I think if more state officials and governors stood up, that would make a big difference, along with Congress. Thank you so much, Wade, for joining us. We really appreciate you being here, Wade Miller.